Doing well today. Sorry I'm not able to be with you and appreciate your patience. Just a couple of quick announcements and also just a couple of details about what you're going to do today. We talked on Friday about how when the war is pretty much brought to an armistice, keep in mind November 11th of 1918, we celebrate as Veterans Day today. That's kind of the first step in the direction of peace. And so what we noticed between then and also early January, you've got all these world leaders that are getting together. They've all got a variety of different ideas about how do you approach peace. Unfortunately for Germany, they don't really have an influence or a voice in the process. So therefore, this treaty that will be, of course, pretty harsh, I think it's safe to say, and especially reflecting on the outcome of it, is going to be pretty important. As far as we're concerned, Woodrow Wilson, guys, keep in mind, has this vision, very idealistic, by the way, you could argue, that he wants to bring over a treaty that reflects this peace without victory and also making the world safe for democracy. Problem is, he's got a group of, especially European countries, particularly France, and then also, of course, Great Britain to a degree as well, that aren't exactly on board with what you might call a lenient or easy treatment of Germany. So the treaty is quite lengthy, but at the end of the day, you've got to focus on Germany paying back reparations. You've got to focus on the self-determination. Basically, what we're looking at there, for the most part, is there are four major empires that are basically going to be broken down in size. You've got Russia, which was already kind of started under their treaty with Germany, but the treaty makes other territories that will be self-governing. Places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we call them the Baltic states, if you've ever heard that, Poland, and of course other places too, whereas Germany is also going to be broken down as far as their territory, and also Austria-Hungary. And then another country we didn't say a lot about, but if you remember from maybe your world history studies, is going to be what we call the Ottoman Empire. So you'll have Turkey, you'll have a lot of these Middle Eastern, what they call mandates, which are going to be under a lot of European control and influence. For example, Egypt will be under British influence for a while, as will, countries like Libya with Italy, Iraq, Transjordan, and also probably the one that probably gets the most attention, especially post-World War II, is going to be Palestine, that eventually is going to become partly the nation of Israel. All right, and that's down the line. Why do I bring this up? So Wilson goes over there with these 14 points. We're going to add this League of Nations, which is basically an organization that is going to hopefully allow for peace, countries to come together. And this is kind of what I would call the big baby, if you will, of Wilson's 14 points. That is basically one of the major things, certainly not the only one, but I would say probably in my view, one of the bigger ones that Wilson is going to get. Self-determination is going to be another thing. Reparations, he was more on the lenient side there. Unfortunately, his allied countries don't agree with him. So what happens? So they negotiate this treaty. Wilson doesn't get everything he wants, but he's somewhat satisfied with it. What's the treaty process constitutionally, for those of you that might not know? Well, the argument is that you come over as president, you negotiate a treaty, and the next step to that is Congress and the Senate particularly. Wilson makes a little bit of an error, I would say, in some people's thinking, and that is he doesn't really bring a lot of Republican support with him over to Versailles. Keep in mind, Wilson is a Democrat. Not that that's a bad thing, but nonetheless, party lines are going to be obviously a problem here. And so he comes over thinking that this treaty is great. And what happens? He's got about a third of the Congress and the Senate particularly that's on board with him. But he has about 2/3 that are divided into a faction each. One group is what we call the reservationists. Their main concern is going to be the level of involvement that American involvement in the League of Nations requires. Essentially, they're concerned about, will this be taking away the constitutional authority of the Senate to be able to declare war? There's more to it, but that's probably the biggest thing. Then you have a group of mostly Republicans called the Irreconcilables. These Irreconcilables were basically kind of bitter at Wilson for not being included in the process as much. So what happens is The argument is doesn't matter how many times they revise the treaty, doesn't matter how many times they attempt to make it better or whatever, they are not going to pass the treaty. And the problem is if you don't have a certain amount of the vote go in one direction toward ratifying it, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately for President Wilson, he has a dilemma. He takes it upon himself to do kind of like I guess what you might would call a somewhat nationwide campaign to get more support for passing this treaty. In the process, Wilson has a stroke. He does not die. He finishes out his second term, but this stroke has a really big effect on his effectiveness to be able to advocate for this treaty. The end result is the treaty is not ratified. And the big picture, guys, moving forward is that as we transition to the 1920s, tomorrow we'll start to look at that. You'll see another short video that I'll put together. Wilson is on his way out. He is not up for being reelected because he chooses not to run. Probably good reason given his health. And what do we notice? We're seeing the first post-World War period in American history, which is going to be defined by political things regarding isolationism. Whether that's completely accurate to say isolationist is debatable, but the main thing is that America is definitely going to have more of a hands-off foreign policy than we did, in the probably 2 decades prior, especially if you remember the big stick diplomacy of President Roosevelt. So this is kind of the basic nuts and bolts. I didn't want to just leave you all kind of like hanging and let Khan Academy, which does a great job, explain this. But that's the basic nuts and bolts. Tomorrow, stay tuned. You will have 2 things to consider. One is going to be a short little video introduction on the Roaring Twenties. You'll have one that you'll watch together. And for the most part, I will be available via email. So thank you for your patience, and I will look forward to seeing you when I get back. Have a good one.